The Kremlin is blaming emotional overload for Donald Trump's critical comments about Vladimir Putin after the US president called his Russian counterpart absolutely crazy. Trump's remarks followed Russia's largest ever aerial assault on Ukraine over the weekend. The Kremlin spokesperson sought to downplay the criticism and instead said Moscow is grateful to the US for help in launching the negotiation process with Ukraine. Great news, of course. At the same time, this is a very crucial moment, which is associated, of course, with the emotional overload of everyone. Absolutely. And with emotional reactions. We follow this very closely. German Chancellor Friedrich March said it's clear Trump is increasingly disillusioned with Putin after the continued attacks on Ukraine. He also spoke about the lifting of range restrictions for weapons delivered to Ukraine by Germany and other Ukrainian allies, a move the Kremlin calls dangerous. CNN's Kristen Holmes has more now from Washington. President Donald Trump having a clear change of public posture when it comes to Russia and Russia's President Vladimir Putin after his phone call with him last week, where he described the relationship as good, saying that Ukraine and Russia were going to go straight to the negotiating table. He is growing frustrated with the Russian president, particularly after that series of attacks we saw over the weekend. This is what he told reporters. I'm not happy with what Putin is doing. He's killing a lot of people, and I don't know what the hell happened to Putin. I've known him a long time, always gotten along with him, but he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all, okay? Okay, we're in the middle of talking, and he's shooting rockets into gear in other cities. I don't like it at all. Now, generally, Donald Trump spends most of his time talking about his good relationship with Vladimir Putin, focusing instead on the actual war in Ukraine, on trade deals or potential economic partnerships, should Russia end the war. It was particularly interesting in this conversation with reporters is that he was asked if he's considering adding additional sanctions to Russia, and in this conversation he said yes because of what he's seeing going on in Ukraine. Last week, after that conversation between Putin and Trump, it seemed like sanctions were all almost completely off the table, or at least additional sanctions. There. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is that Donald Trump continues to try and back away from this conflict. He once said that he would resolve in 24 hours in a series of posts over the weekend. He also said this wasn't his problem, it wasn't his war. He blamed it on Zelensky, on Putin, and even on Joe Biden. Kristen Holmes, CNN, The White House. Jill Dougherty is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. She's also a former CNN Moscow bureau chief and the author of My Russia, What I Saw Inside the Kremlin. Appreciate you joining us. Hey, Rosemary, good to be here. Wonderful. So, one day after President Donald Trump called Vladimir Putin absolutely crazy for targeting civilian planes in Russia's biggest aerial attack since the start of the war, the Kremlin is now responding, saying Donald Trump may be suffering an emotional overload. So what does this signal to you, and how likely is it that Donald Trump will now respond by imposing additional sanctions on Russia to get Putin to the negotiating table? Well, that coming up by actually Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for the president of Russia, was this is emotional for everyone. It is highly emotional. Emotional overload is the word that he used. So I think what they're trying to do is, it doesn't look good for the president of the United States to call the president of Russia crazy. It doesn't look good domestically for President Putin to be called crazy. So I think what they're trying to do, they want to continue to talk with the United States. Putin apparently doesn't want peace now at all, but they want to keep talking. So what they're trying to do is kind of smooth down, the edges of this comments by President Trump and keep the ball rolling. But not create too many problems in the relationship at this point. And Jill, President Trump appears shocked that Putin is targeting civilians with a deadly aerial attack, shooting rockets into Kyiv and other cities, while in the middle of peace talks, is what he observed. But most other world leaders already knew what Putin was capable of. Why did it take so long for Trump and his administration to realize who they're dealing with? Well, it might be that there is a difference between his administration and the president himself, because the administration has, in some cases, sounded a little bit harder. But President Trump, actually, I believe, thought that he could get a deal with the power of his personality and that personal relationship with Vladimir Putin. It hasn't happened. And it must be intensely frustrating. And you can hear it, in the president's comments calling Putin crazy. He sounds angry and he sounds frustrated. But the question is, Rosemary, and you ask, will he do anything about it? Will he follow through on what he said? I'm, open to considering sanctions. But he didn't say what kind of sanctions, and he said this before. He said it numerous times that, he's not happy, we should do this, etc. But he has not actually pushed for new sanctions. And that is the crux. And it could be sanctions. It could also be military aid for Ukraine. And he's not doing that either. And meantime, European leaders reaffirming their support for Ukraine and renewing ceasefire calls after Putin's aerial assault on Ukraine and after Trump called Putin absolutely crazy. They are hoping that this signals that Washington will now take a harder line in pressuring Putin to the negotiating table. But as you've pointed out, we're not seeing any signs of that right now. So what do you expect might happen next? Well, you have the Europeans now saying that the Ukrainians can use weapons that they get from the Europeans to actually attack Russia, long range. That's something that President Biden did not want to do. He was very concerned that that would create even more problems and even lead to some type of war. But the Europeans are now apparently moving ahead on that. And the Russian spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said that that could be dangerous. That would be a dangerous step. So I think the war right now is, continuing for force. In fact, perhaps even more for us. And then the peace negotiations, always very hard to say what President Trump will do next. But he could still walk away. There's still that possibility. Even though he threatens to walk away, but then he doesn't, and he's back in the game again. But he could walk away and finally say, look, Putin's crazy, Zelensky. And he had criticism for Zelensky as well. Zelensky creates problems now every time he opens his mouth, and therefore I am walking away. It's almost as if he is talking to school children. There is that castigating tone, and we'll just have to see where that leads.